In the autumn of 1941, deep inside the smoky planning rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a handful of officers bent over maps and fuel consumption charts, trying to predict the future of a war they had not yet declared. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and quiet tension. At the center of the table lay a single estimate, one set of numbers that would shape the fate of an empire. Japan's strategists believed they had exactly 2 years of oil reserves to wage a full-scale war. 2 years to conquer Southeast Asia, secure resources, and force the United States into negotiations. But the calculation was built on an assumption so fragile, no one noticed it. The projected fuel consumption rate of Japan's Navy was off by nearly 15%. It seemed small, harmless even, but in naval warfare, a few percent meant dozens of ships stranded, operations canceled, and fleets unable to sail. The error began with a mistaken formula, an outdated figure for fuel burn at cruising speed. A mid-ranking officer recopied the number without updating it to match the Navy's newer, heavier ships. No one double-checked it. No one questioned why the numbers felt optimistic. The Japanese command was so determined to believe in a quick victory that a comforting mistake passed as fact. When Admiral Yamamoto reviewed the oil projections, he hesitated. Something felt wrong, but the political pressure was suffocating. Japan was already strangled by the American oil embargo. Waiting meant defeat without fighting. And so he accepted the optimistic fuel tables, knowing they were the foundation for every major operation, from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. The consequences began to surface almost immediately. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers returned to home waters with tanks far emptier than expected. Destroyers escorting them barely made the journey back. Fleet commanders quietly reported that fuel margins are significantly narrower than projected. But the high command dismissed the warnings. The initial calculation could not be wrong. The empire had gambled everything on it. By mid-1942, the truth became undeniable. Japan wasn't operating on a 2-year fuel reserve. It was closer to 9 months, less if the fleet continued fighting at full intensity. The error multiplied across every front. Submarine patrols were shortened, training flights reduced, and entire naval groups forced to sit idle. The war Japan planned was no longer the war it could afford. In the end, the miscalculation was not just numerical. It was psychological. Japan believed it could win quickly because it had convinced itself the numbers allowed it. When reality arrived, louder than calculations, colder than strategy, it was already too late. A single overlooked formula had silently begun the collapse of an empire. In 1941, as Japan prepared to launch its bold strike across the Pacific, its military leaders shared one quiet assumption. An assumption whispered in planning rooms, repeated in briefings, and embedded in every strategy. America would not be able to fight a long war. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed the United States was soft, unfocused, politically divided, and, most importantly, too slow to mobilize its industry. Japanese intelligence reports described Americans as mechanically skilled but lacking discipline, and their factories as powerful but inefficient. Even the famed U.S. shipyards were dismissed as overstated. They believed America needed years to build a fleet. Japan believed it needed months to win the war. This belief shaped every decision leading up to Pearl Harbor. But it was a belief built on an astonishing miscalculation. Japan did not understand what American industry truly was. While Tokyo planners studied U.S. ship counts and aircraft inventories, they ignored the thing that mattered most: capacity. The ability to not only build weapons, but to build them faster, cheaper, and in quantities the world had never seen. In the winter of 1942, the first signs of Japan's mistake began to appear. At the Kaiser shipyards on the American West Coast, welders were working in shifts that never ended. Sparks lit up the night sky as enormous hulls slid down greased slipways. Liberty ships were being built so quickly that workers joked a man could watch his ship assembled while eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Factories in Detroit, once famous for cars, were retooled in record time. Ford's Willow Run plant produced B-24 Liberator bombers at an impossible pace, one every hour. Aircraft production multiplied so rapidly that Japan's estimates of U.S. capabilities became outdated within weeks. Meanwhile, Japan's industrial engine was already cracking. Limited iron, limited steel, limited fuel. Factories scattered across the home islands struggled to replace even the aircraft lost in training accidents, let alone those destroyed in combat. By 1943, America was launching carriers faster than Japan could repair them. Destroyers, cruisers, tanks, artillery. Everything Japan thought would take years to produce was now rolling off assembly lines in endless columns. The U.S. Navy expanded so quickly that entire fleets were sent into battle composed of ships that didn't even exist on paper 12 months earlier. Japan had believed America would break under pressure. Instead, America absorbed the first blows and responded with a tidal wave of steel, fuel, and firepower. A U.S. submarine captain later wrote, "Every time we sank a Japanese ship, America built 3 more to replace it. Every time they sank one of ours, America built 10. The truth was clear by mid-war. Japan had not just underestimated America's industry, they had misunderstood the very concept of American production. They thought they were fighting a nation. Instead, they were fighting a continent-sized machine powered by factories, railroads, refineries, and millions of workers who turned their labor into unstoppable momentum. Japan planned for a short war. America prepared for a total one. And once the industrial giant fully awakened, the outcome of the Pacific War was already written. In the months leading up to Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, a quiet crisis was already unfolding deep inside the Imperial Japanese Navy's planning rooms. It wasn't about battleships or aircraft carriers. It wasn't about tactics or courage. It was about oil, the one resource Japan needed more desperately than anything else. By 1941, Japan imported over 90% of its oil. Most of it came from the United States. So when America cut off supply in response to Japanese expansion, Tokyo suddenly faced the most terrifying problem for any modern military. Their empire could run out of fuel before their war even began. Admirals and strategists scrambled to calculate how long Japan could continue to function. On paper, the numbers looked workable. Japan believed it had enough reserves for 2 years of full-scale war, enough time to cripple American forces, seize resource-rich territories, and then negotiate peace from a position of strength. But there was a fatal problem with these calculations. The numbers were wrong. The Navy's fuel estimates were based on optimistic projections, incomplete data, and, worst of all, wishful thinking. Many planners simply assumed ships would burn less fuel than they actually did. Training consumption was underestimated. Combat operations were idealized. The cost of moving fleets across the vast Pacific was barely considered. Japan thought it had 2 years of oil. In reality, it had barely half that. And every major decision Japan made, from seizing the Dutch East Indies to striking Pearl Harbor, was built on those faulty assumptions. Once the war began, the truth became impossible to ignore. Japanese carriers burned enormous amounts of fuel racing across the Pacific. Battleships swallowed thousands of tons simply repositioning. Submarines that were meant for long-range patrols suddenly couldn't patrol anything at all. By mid-1942, Japanese naval officers began whispering the quiet fear they dared not say aloud. "We cannot replace what we are burning." The occupation of the East Indies, which was supposed to solve the oil crisis, only made things worse. Wells were sabotaged. Refineries were destroyed. Transport tankers, slow and unprotected, became easy prey for American submarines that prowled shipping lanes like wolves. What oil Japan did manage to extract couldn't even be moved safely. By 1944, the empire had oil in the ground, but almost none in its ships. Fuel shortages reshaped the entire war. Training flights were reduced. Pilots entered combat with barely any experience. Ships were ordered to conserve fuel by staying in port, leaving whole fleets unused. Even during critical moments like the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's commanders struggled not only with strategy, but with the simple question, do we have enough fuel to get home? In the final year of the war, Japanese ships were so desperate that they sailed on crude, unrefined oil that damaged engines and reduced speed. Many vessels never left harbor again. The Navy, the pride of the empire, had become a collection of steel giants stranded at anchor. And it all traced back to the same tragic root, a miscalculation made before the war even started. Japan didn't just run out of oil. It ran out of time, options, and the strategic freedom to choose its destiny. The war Japan fought was shaped, not by its admirals, not by its pilots, not even by its ships, but by a few lines of numbers in an oil report that told a comforting lie. A lie the empire didn't discover until it was far too late. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, as the Japanese strike force closed in on Oahu, the mood aboard the carriers was a strange mix of tension and triumph. Pilots checked their watches, touching family photos taped beside their gauges. Officers whispered to one another that the Americans would be caught asleep, their battleships helpless, their response slow and confused. Everything, every calculation, every prediction pointed to an overwhelming victory. But the numbers behind that confidence were already wrong. Months before the attack, Japanese planners had studied America's naval behavior with great precision. They measured how long U.S. crews took to sound alarms, how fast American ships could raise steam, and how many minutes it usually took for a harbor to organize aircraft. These figures were turned into charts, then into confident predictions. A surprise attack will disable the U.S. Pacific Fleet for at least 6 months. The Americans will be emotionally crushed. Their spirit will break. What they didn't know was that those numbers came from outdated intelligence, reports collected during peacetime exercises years earlier. In reality, the U.S. Navy had been quietly improving readiness after the war in Europe erupted. Response times were faster, coordination tighter, communication sharper. The math that Japan used to justify the attack was based on a version of America that no longer existed. Even worse, a small but crucial miscalculation was buried inside Admiral Nagumo's strike plan. Japanese analysts estimated that crippling the U.S. battleships would effectively paralyze American naval operations. They assumed battleships were the heart of U.S. power because they were still the heart of Japan's own navy. The calculations, once again, were built on old assumptions. But in 1941, the United States was already shifting toward something radically different, a carrier-centered fleet. That shift wasn't obvious from the outside, and Japanese observers dismissed early signs of it as temporary or unimportant. So the attack plan that seemed mathematically flawless was actually targeting the wrong era of naval warfare. In the attack's aftermath, flames filled the harbor, oil burned on the water, and thick smoke climbed into the sky. Japanese pilots returned to their carriers believing they had scored a perfect victory. But even as the fleet sailed away, the flaw in the logic became clear. America's carriers were not in the harbor. They were alive, mobile, and soon furious. And another error lingered. Japanese planners had calculated that America would need at least 2 years to replace battleships and repair damaged ones. They underestimated U.S. industrial speed by nearly 50%. Shipyards that Japan thought would move sluggishly instead worked around the clock. What was supposed to be a crippling blow became a brief setback. Pearl Harbor looked like a masterpiece of planning. But beneath the explosions and the shock, the entire operation rested on bad math, outdated data, false assumptions, and projections that ignored the industrial and strategic reality of the United States. The attack was dramatic, devastating, and historic, but it was built on numbers that did not tell the truth. And those errors ensured that what began as Japan's greatest victory would soon become the beginning of its defeat. By 1943, the Japanese Empire still stretched across the Pacific like a giant shadow, from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Solomons. But inside Japan's military headquarters in Tokyo, the mood was no longer triumphant. Maps were cluttered with red pins marking American advances. Oil reserves were shrinking into numbers too small to hide, and supply lines that once seemed unstoppable were thinning into fragile threads. For the first time, the math was undeniable. Japan's early victories had created a dangerous illusion that speed and boldness could outrun arithmetic. But logistics, the quiet, merciless side of war, had begun to speak louder than strategy. Every new island Japan seized required more ships, more fuel, more aircraft, more men. And every one of those things required resources Japan simply didn't have. American intelligence analysts had understood this imbalance long before Japan did. They calculated that Japan's empire required 3 times more fuel to maintain than Japan could realistically extract or transport. They estimated that Japan needed to protect over 20,000 kilometers of supply lines with a navy already stretched thin. Underneath the dramatic sea battles, the spreadsheets were already forecasting Japan's collapse. The turning point came with the Battle of Midway in 1942, when Japan lost 4 veteran aircraft carriers, a blow its industry could not recover from. Japanese planners believed their shipyards could replace carriers within 2 years. In reality, U.S. shipyards were producing them in months, while Japan struggled to complete even a single replacement. The arithmetic gap widened with every passing week. Then came the Solomon Islands campaign. Japan's strategy insisted on holding Guadalcanal at all costs, yet the numbers behind that decision were catastrophic. Supply ships attempted to run the gauntlet at night, delivering food only to starve themselves of fuel. Soldiers on the island lived on half rations, then quarter rations. In Tokyo, officers still planned grand offensives. Meanwhile, troops on the ground were too weak to stand. Strategy drifted farther and farther from reality. By late 1944, when the U.S. Navy launched its massive push toward the Philippines, the imbalance was overwhelming. America fielded more carriers than Japan ever believed possible. Its pilots received better training, more fuel, more ammunition. Japanese pilots, once elite, now flew with only 40 hours of training, rushed into combat because the empire could no longer afford to lose time. Many were shot down before they ever fired a shot. The numbers were catching up. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, shattered what remained of Japan's navy. The emperor's admirals still believed bold maneuvers could turn the tide, but their ships lacked radar, fuel, and experienced crews. America's overwhelming industrial power made the outcome inevitable. When Japan's leadership finally confronted the arithmetic truth in 1945, it was too late. The empire had stretched itself across the Pacific without the logistical foundation to support it. The math they once ignored had become their executioner. In the end, Japan's collapse wasn't only the result of lost battles. It was the result of simple, undeniable numbers. Too few resources, too little industry, too many miles of ocean to defend. Strategy can defy logic for a moment, but not forever. Eventually, the math always catches up.